Hello, everyone. Glad you are here today and that you are walking through 1 Corinthians with us. I hope you've been with us on this journey, and it's been one of the most challenging and difficult studies that I've done in my entire life, but it's been a blessing, and I hope that it's a blessing to you. If you appreciate this content, I would encourage you to share it with somebody, whether that's sharing one of our updates, texting somebody a link to an episode. Maybe there's a particular episode you've got a question about. Maybe you can use it as the basis for a study with someone where you can both read the passage and listen to this, and it can generate some discussion on how we approach the Bible together. We want this to be a resource and a blessing to you and the church. So if it is, we're always going to have this free, never be behind a paywall. We'll never charge anything for this. But if it does bless you, you can return your thanks by sharing that or liking the page, liking the updates and stuff like that. It makes a difference. It makes a difference, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Today, we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 to 20. 1 Corinthians 7, 17 to 20. Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this way let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He's not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He's not to become circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is keeping the commandments of God. Each person is to remain in the state in which he was called. I feel a bit like I've been running through a gauntlet, and the peace I feel in recording this episode is really transcendent and sublime. The last several months, it's a lot of intense texts with high stakes on them. The last 7 of 8 episodes have dealt with sexual immorality, sex in marriage, and divorce. The only break that we've gotten in that was dealing with singleness and getting married, which itself has some charge to it. So it's been difficult, but it's been good, and I've been challenged by it. I hope you have too. To review, because of the transformation brought about by Christ, Paul has called the Corinthians to flee sexual sin. It's not the sort of thing you can mess with. You must run. You must flee. You can't fight it. However, well, I guess you can fight it. The way you fight it is to flee. However, this isn't an issue with sexuality in general, because God made that, and God made it good. It's an issue of the setting and the place in which we enter in those relations. Married couples should joyfully and routinely engage in physical intimacy. We described this as a posture of sexual availability towards their spouse. Check out those episodes. I think it's chapter 7, 1 through 4, and then maybe 5 and 6. These all go together. Next, Paul gives advice to people who are married or widows. He advocates for people to remain single as he is, but he doesn't forbid people to marry if they can't contain their passions. Next, Paul turns to address the married, and he calls them to remain in their marriages, to be dedicated to their marriages. Christians should have a commitment and a desire to support their spouses because their spouse and their children are the people they have the most influence over. That said, if a Christian is married to someone who's an unbeliever, they should be committed to it, but if the unbeliever doesn't want any part of it, God's called us in peace, and so we should let them go, but we should always act out of a sincere desire to save their spouse, and more generally when it comes to marriage, we should act out of a desire for their sanctification, for their holiness, and for our children. What's going to lead to them knowing Christ? Because that's the thing that ultimately matters, as he kind of mentions today. This text is still challenging, and in fact, comments on the situations that we've mentioned, but perhaps isn't so divisive. And that said, I do actually think this is one of the key principles at work in 1 Corinthians 7, which helps us understand Paul's logic and rationale in places where he doesn't rule explicitly on what to do. In truth, I think this text should really hit us square in the face because it confronts some of the basic assumptions we have and reforms them accordingly. Today's big idea is walk as you are called. Walk as you are called. Our supporting ideas are, number 1, don't change your status. Number 2, obedience is what matters. And number 3, stay as you are. Don't change your status. Obedience is what matters. And stay as you are. Change, matters, and stay will be those 3 words. Keep focused on. Paul begins with an exhortation. And that exhortation forms our big idea, which is to walk as you are called. This is really a disposition that pervades the entire chapter. Paul says, walk as you were called. And this is a bit of a strange phrase. We probably wouldn't phrase it in this way today. But it means to keep the same manner of life as when you became a Christian. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, but whenever I hear that, I'm kind of like shot, like, don't change? Because if you listen to this podcast with any frequency, you may be shocking to hear me say don't change, because I use words, I did a quick word search. I use words like transformation, change, turn upside down, revolutionize, basically every episode. And so the idea of the gospel demanding change, I'm always emphatic about the gospel demanding repentance. And so for me to say that, hey, you shouldn't change, you should keep the same manner of life as when you became a Christian. Non-Christian became a Christian, same manner of life across that. Does this mean that we can just come as we are and never change? No, that's not what Paul's talking about here. Paul is emphatic there's some changes that are demanded by the gospel. If we refuse to accept and participate in them, we're conforming our lives to the standard of the world instead of the standard of Christ. For example, he spent forever talking about sexual sin. This is something a Christian can't participate in. Paul wants them to get out of that situation if it's one that they're in. There are other cases where that and other things where if they don't get out of that situation, they just decide to stay in it, the church community must reject them if they refuse to give up those actions. So there's some stations which must be changed, some positions we're in. Paul declares joyfully that there are some sins which they previously did, but they abandoned to know Christ. And that said, I use this word manner of life, or this calling, this vocation. These are the things that don't have to change. Christ requires a complete and total reevaluation of our beliefs, our priorities, our commitments, and station. We've used that word, our manner of life. But he doesn't necessarily require a complete and total change of them. Catch that. We must reevaluate, according to the standard of Christ, everything. But it doesn't mean that we have to change everything. Christ is calling us to have a radical willingness to leave everything behind, to totally reestablish and reorient our values, hopes, and dreams. But doesn't mean we should change things for the sake of changing them. We only change things for the sake of Christ, not for the sake of change. In the second point, Paul gives a more extensive example that kind of helps us understand the sorts of things that he is actually talking about. He says, if you are called as a circumcised man, don't become uncircumcised. Similarly, if you were called as an uncircumcised man, don't strive to become circumcised. He emphasizes that neither of these are any better than any other, but what matters is keeping the commandments of God. That's what has value, not this particular biological reality. For the uncircumcised guy, it would be possible for him to undergo that physical operation. However, for the circumcised man, it's not really possible to undo that. So there's a couple things that could be happening. First is Paul could be speaking hyperbolically to show how ludicrous it is to try and change a person's station. I mean, once you've had that biological removal going on, it's just kind of what's done is done, and it makes one not really better than the other. But second, and probably included in the first one, is he's not just referring to the state of one's anatomy, but he's referring more generally to the cultural identities of Jew and Greek. The cultural identities of Jew and Greek, and that's kind of how we're going to think about it. Being a Christian doesn't require us to conform the expectations, or conform to the expectations and norms of a particular society. It requires us to bloom where we're planted. Things in Jewish culture involved circumcision, obviously the food laws, cleanliness laws, and things like this. So those aren't any necessarily better than the other. Further, striving to be like a certain set of Christians in a different culture that is outside of the one that I'm kind of planted in can do more damage, discontinuity, and disharmony than anything else. Obviously, when I get into that situation, I need to adapt accordingly, as we'll talk about later in chapter 9. But if I'm over here in America and I decide to start dressing like the Christians in sub-Saharan Africa, India, the Middle East, or the Far East, that's not going to bring me any closer to Christ, right? If I go over there, I may want to adapt accordingly, but to look at them and say, wow, those are great Christians, I'm going to start doing the outward things that they do. That's not going to do anything because the matters of dress and cleanliness and diet and stuff like that, it's not inherently Christian. Further, it's going to just put me at odds with the people here. Christians in those places shouldn't necessarily try to adapt to my culture because those things aren't inherently spiritual either. Paul says what matters isn't conformity to some particular set of cultural norms and rhythms, but what matters is keeping the commandments of God. God's not so concerned with the particular trappings of a set of people. He's concerned with righteousness, mercy, and faith. And we can't confuse one for the other, as though there's certain practices that are more spiritual in their cultural dimension than the other. There's pluses and minuses, and it's a whole much bigger discussion than that. So I shouldn't just throw off and say, well, I'm going to be like that person and just totally change everything about me. No. There's things we shouldn't change. And Paul restates the principle that overarches this example. We're to stay in the state in which we're called. As we mentioned, we must have a willingness to reevaluate, but we all shouldn't change things just to change them. Beyond the example of Paul gives, this is most principally shown in our previous episodes on marriage. Becoming a servant of Christ means doing all that's in your power to not change your marital status. Abandoning your duty to your spouse, believing or unbelieving, or your children is a completely unchristian thing to do. Further, while Christ calls us in Luke 14 not to let our work get in the way of a relationship with him, there's plenty of wholesome and acceptable occupations to be a part of. Teacher, engineer, entrepreneur, carpenter, doctor, secretary, cashier, waiter, waitress, and many others. In these cases, Christ will change the way we conduct ourselves within them, but if it's a particular career that we've chosen from it, there's not anything inherently unwholesome in that demands fleeing, then we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't get out of it. It's not like we should come to Christ and be like, okay, I'm here. Must change careers now. Boom. Well, not necessarily. Perhaps the answer is to bring Christianity into that particular situation. Obviously, there's certain things that thrive on sinfulness and make merchandise of sin, and that should be abandoned. But generally, these sorts of things are fine, and they're allowable, and we shouldn't look to just jump out of them willy-nilly for no reason, thinking it'll fix all our problems. Because here's the thing. Sometimes people are really looking for an exit out of a situation that they don't like. And they'll talk about how it's a spiritual decision, which basically puts this in the God told me to. And then people will give you a pass, even if they think you're being legitimately irresponsible. You shouldn't play the God card just to justify your personal desires. And sometimes people end up doing that. Paul notes this isn't a Corinthian thing, but it's a uniform teaching as he teaches in all the church of the saints. So we should look to implement this. God's a lot less concerned with your happiness and a lot more concerned with your holiness. He's less concerned with your happiness and more concerned about your holiness. And many times we'll look for the easiest, most comfortable route when holiness is not found in the easy path where we say, oh, well, I'll do this easier and then I can do all these things. No, holiness is found in fulfilling our duty and learning to bloom where we're planted in spite of the difficulties. So with that, for all the fantastic service and sacrifice we're called to, sometimes the duty of the call isn't to change. The sacrifice is staying where you are. Sometimes when people grow spiritually discontent, we think a change of scenery equals spiritual growth. Now, next time, we'll talk about the fact that there are definitely times to pursue a change of scenery as it becomes available. And we've already discussed the need to flee sin, so there's certain stuff we got to get out of. However, we must be careful because the grass isn't always greener on the other side of the fence. It's greener where you water it. And sometimes there's more trouble than our idealistic eyes will allow us to see. And we'll bring on a whole other host of problems because of our irresponsibility, because of our hastiness. We can't mistake spiritual motion for spiritual progress. Let me say that again. You can't mistake spiritual motion for spiritual progress because a change of circumstances will not fix your problems if the problem is you and not your circumstances. Say that one more time. A change of circumstances won't fix your problems if the problem is you and not your circumstances. Certainly, there are sometimes the circumstances must be gotten out of. The geography has to change, absolutely. But sometimes we're just doing cosmetic fixes on something that's really broken down to the very core of us. So are you invested in the situations that you are in? Are you committed to your responsibilities and duties, or are you looking for any excuse you can to ghost out of that situation and just let it fall and everybody else pick up the pieces? Do you believe that the grace of Christ is sufficient in your situation, even if it's difficult, even if it's incomprehensibly difficult? Are you always looking for the next thing to fix your spiritual inadequacies, or do you dig into what has worked for saints of all time and build the discipline and build the character that you need to get through this situation and every situation? Or are you looking for a quick hit to get mature fast? Are you digging and dialed into Christ every single day and investing in that situation, trusting his growth in spite of circumstances that are uncomfortable. Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: walk as you are called.